So we're going to talk about language, and just for future's sake, because like I've said many times, I do have a lot to say about language. We're going to go ahead and call this part 1 for now. I'm sure there's going to be more parts, but wanted to cover language because language really, in many ways, is one of the most important things when we're telling a story. The different words that you use, the different phrases you use, various idioms, everything has a political connotation, whether we want it to or not. So let's start with the basics of language. What is a language? When I was a little baby linguist, only about 3 years into study, one of my professors, he asked the class, he said, what's the difference between the language we use and the barks of a dog? And a lot of us, we couldn't really think of it. He said, the difference is a dog can't tell you that he's going to bite you and then not do it, right? A dog can signal things like, I want to bite you, I feel an aggression, things like that, but they can't go back on it. In other words, like, they have a tough time lying, right? And that's not to say that all language is based on lies, even though there are some theories of linguistics that do suggest maybe the ability to lie is what helped us develop language. It's more that complexity of thought sort of necessitates some kind of language. We can't communicate our complex ideas without thoughts. It's one of the things that Orwell covered in 1984, as you may be aware of Newspeak. The ultimate goal of Newspeak, right, is to purge from the language any ideas that would be a threat to the government, and therefore, if nobody has a way to express those ideas, they can't organize any kind of resistance. So we need language for our complex ideas. Now, if you're writing a story, the things to consider when it comes to language, when you're let's give aliens as an example. We could also use, like, a fantasy setting, we could use elves or whatever. I like to use aliens as an example because a lot of people already have that in mind, even if you're not a science fiction fan. A lot of people are passingly familiar with Star Trek, Star Wars, things like that. So I want you to think about the aliens and those properties, and think about the way language is handled. There are 3 main ways I've seen language handled in most science fiction. The first way is the universal translator method, where aliens are talking to each other. We hear or see English, depending on whether we're reading or watching a show or movie. But it's assumed to us that they're speaking in their own native language, and it's just being translated for the purposes of the story. Another way we see is what usually happens in the Star Wars method. In the Star Wars method, you have guys like Han Solo. He can understand a variety of alien languages. They're subtitled for us. He speaks in his tongue. They speak in theirs. They're still mutually intelligible. And we've even got, in Return of the Jedi, we've got C-3PO acting as a translator. It's further showing that, language is a little more realistic in these settings, right? And then we've got what the new Star Trek has done, Star Trek Discovery. In Star Trek Discovery, it's a universal translator. They have one. But it's not on all the time. If Klingons are talking to themselves, they're speaking in Klingon. We have subtitles for the words they're using, right? All of these, really, they're just different dramatic ways to convey things. So you can decide for yourself which one would work better for your story. But what it gets you thinking about is the fact that not everyone's going to speak the same language. And a lot of times that get applied to like a whole planet, right? Like there is Klingon language. And they've made references in canon to there being different dialects, accents, things like that. But realistically, that's what would happen. In the world, they've developed a Klingon language that is like Klingon standard. That's what people learn when they learn Klingon. That's what people are talking about when they talk about knowing Klingon. Anytime that Klingon appears in any of the official media, it's that standard Klingon. It's not a lot of variation there, right? And that can be a lot of work to make that kind of variation. But what you have to consider is, think about, let's say the East Coast, right? East Coast is a really small place. I say that as someone from the West. Spent a lot of time in Colorado, California, the thing. I say it's a small place because like the difference between what's near and what's far is really, really different once you get onto the East Coast. 4 hours is a day trip in Colorado. But I go out to Maryland. When I was living in Maryland, we'd go to visit family in New Jersey. That same 4 hours, we need a 3-day weekend or more. That's too far, right? It's the same amount of time. It's just because things are so much closer together out there, their sense of different distance is different. So think about how close everybody is out there. And think about the fact that you've got Boston and you've got Reading, Pennsylvania, right? They're speaking completely different types of English. They sound different. They have different sets of slang. They have different social cues at times for what, like, formality of language that they're using. And that's just in one country, on one planet. Imagine if you have a whole world, right? Even if they have a unified culture. That whole world, you've got little pockets of communities that are developing slang on their own. Because like I talked about before, language is living. And that's the hardest thing for some people to really understand, is how alive language really is. Language is so alive that we go back 450 years to around Shakespeare's time. That's modern English still, right? Language is so alive that that's still considered modern English. People call it Old English, they're wrong. Old English is way different. You got to go back a bunch more years and then you get into things like Beowulf and such, right? Anglo-Saxon. That's the Old English. So the fact that that's modern, right? That really tells you that's language is alive and it's constantly changing. And it's constantly changing within communities, right? The slang that I used in my middle school, completely different than the slang that was used at other middle schools, even though we came from the same culture, even within the same state, right? Because that's the way language works. So it would only make sense that on a planet, people are going to speak differently. And what does that necessitate when you're thinking about writing your story? Either you need some kind of device that does the translating for you, or you need translators, like flesh and blood people, beings, who know the nuances of different languages. And nuance is another key, because that's something I hardly see ever when it comes to science fiction, are things like idioms, proper idiomatic use, right? Those aren't something you can translate literally. That's what makes them idiomatic. Translating them literally, they don't make sense to somebody who doesn't use that idiom. I've seen it come up once in Star Trek. technically once. There was a whole episode of The Next Generation called Darmok that I'm sure you are familiar with because you are watching this on the internet, and the whole internet knows about Darmok. All right, Darmok was it's one of my favorite episodes of The Next Generation as a linguist, but it's also super inaccurate as far as how language works, and there have been a number of fan theories that have come up around the episode specifically because of that, to try and explain it away. That's not what I'm talking about. There was one other time on Star Trek that I remember the challenges of idioms coming up, and it was someone went in to talk to the captain. Somebody said, "I'd like to be a fly on the wall for that conversation. Know what I mean?" And the other person was all like, "I don't, but if it's anything like being a spider under the table," that's, they're talking about idioms, translating idioms literally. Now, your universal translator or your flesh and blood translator is going to have to be familiar enough to the language that they can do one of two things with the idioms. Either they can explain the idiom in a succinct way, because if you're translating, it's all about speed, real-time communication. Or they've got to be able to replace it with an idiom that means roughly the same thing, right? That's one of the challenges of translating in the first place, is shades of meaning, connotations with different words, what words you choose. And that goes back to the politics of language. That's all we're going to do for part 1. On Monday, I will see you guys for part 2, where I'm going to have another 10 or 15 minutes talking about language. And then I'm sure some of you will be bored. So the update after that, next Wednesday, I'm going to be starting reviews. I have been asked by 3 people, and considering the size of my viewership right now, 3 people is actually a huge percentage. Anyway, those people, because we know each other personally, we talk a lot about film and television. We're going to do more of a like a literary analysis type review, as I would do for a book if I was teaching a class or taking a class. So that'll be coming up next Wednesday. I want to thank everybody for your support. I want to thank you for your viewership. If you like what I have to say and you want to hear more, make sure you hit the like and subscribe. Get that bell notification icon pressed on YouTube so that you can make sure and hear about any new videos I put out. I did put out a couple of extras both here and on Facebook Live that haven't been part of the regular update schedule, so you never know. And if you want to support me in a more personal and financial way, we are available on Patreon. There are some exclusives there. So go ahead to patreon.com/touchbone. I'd like to give a shout out to McMonster Media. McMonster Media, I am going to be contracting soon for a book cover for a book I hope to have back from my editor by hopefully mid-November, so I can get that out. So check out McMonster Media. They have a Facebook page and a Teespring page, and she does great work. Anyway, thanks for joining me. I will see you guys on Friday for our fiction update. We're getting back to that. I've been working hard at getting typed up my paranormal detective story, Adam Mason, the Paranormal Dick. That'll be coming on Friday. As always, I'll be publishing it to the Patreon site, so go ahead and check that out. You guys have a great Wednesday. I will see you later. Bye.